r/AskReddit by Reddit. Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Saw a new client for our first session at my home practice. We seemed to click and work together fine. He said he wanted to work through some trauma he'd experienced when he was physically attacked by a previous psychologist. Hearing about terrible psychologists always riles me up, so I was immediately on his side. When I talked with my supervisor about the case a week later, she asked me his full name, which never happens, so I was weirded out immediately. She googled the name then and there and wordlessly handed me her iPad. It was full of news articles about this client and his attacks on psychologists in my local area. I obviously did not see him again, but I was nervous for ages because he knew where I lived. This is terrifying. One of my fears is accidentally letting someone dangerous into my home. See mom, this is why I'm antisocial. Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the eval is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act, like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole level, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it, that he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later, and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wiffle beater had dark red/brown stains on it. The door was behind him and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. First thing I was taught when doing psych rounds, never let a patient get between you and the door. First thing they told us when we did psych. I remember this one old psychiatrist whose face just didn't look right and had a weird hand. Apparently had a patient come in years ago who thought that God was telling him the psychiatrist was Satan. Took a meat cleaver to the guy and cut him up really bad. The psychiatrist couldn't get out of his office because the patient chair was between him and the desk. They ended up rearranging all the offices at the university clinics, so the psychiatrist would always be sitting closer to the door and there was always a desk separating them from the patient. The rapist in training in my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague, but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag and his car was full of beanbags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying, and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well, because you never know who's plotting your murder. When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man in his 30s who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then rape their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He'd say that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He'd drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice in friend's house, and while she was gone, he'd go back and rape her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls, it's about the dominance and power that come with having sex with them. He's being rehabilitated now though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful, because if he was, he is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child porn, his I feel terribles were transparent and so full of crap it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to, but with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better. Crazy. Edit. Grammar mistake / clarity. Obligatory, not a psychologist, but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class. At school, in front, is a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid. And because he didn't give a duck about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and unthrough 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was, and one day he asked me would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car. I told him I didn't know, and tried to change the subject. Then he asked what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out, and I had to report it to the SPED teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the crap out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him in case he did or said anything to upset her. Not a psych, but I worked with paralegals for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with them. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because they understood him. At this point, I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole and he did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on for some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it all. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for himself. Towards the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and whether I was parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later, and while I'm all for rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there. Thank you for watching Reddit. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more r/AskReddit videos. Share your stories in the comments section below.